There we go. Do you have a cutoff, by the way, for today?
Probably just an hour. I think
Okay.
we'll just kind of keep this to an hour anyway. That way, we
Yep.
don't start rambling on about stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Do wow, I can't. Office hours. And then Twitter. How was that cyclone, by the way? Yeah, I assume you're all like everything was fine.
We're good. Had a neighbor lost his shed. That was about the biggest damage around us. But it was funny because he lost it before the cyclone. Like in the lead up to it, a tree collapsed on it. Yeah, just because it gets windy beforehand. Old tree. So kind of had to just go out there with the chainsaw and help him pull it apart. And
you have a chainsaw just on the ready?
No, I borrowed one from my brother. He has one.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then, yeah, brother was out of power. Family was out of power for a while. We still got some friends without power, just living off generators. But yeah, they live in somewhat further out remote locations. So, but yeah, I don't know, came out of nowhere, which is pretty funny.
I saw some videos of a couple of the people sort of against the water, and I was just like, "This seems
a lot of
very
fake
Australian."
videos out there.
Oh,
and
it's
also
fake.
Like, yeah, and there's a lot, like it floods a lot here, so a lot of people were like reusing footage from the floods as the cyclone.
Gotcha.
But the actual cyclone itself wasn't that bad. It was the lead up and the aftermath. Like the aftermath was worse than the actual cyclone for my location. Like other locations got destroyed, but for where I was, because we're behind some like islands, it like kind of protected our location a fair bit.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't too bad. But people probably have heard of like the Gold Coast. It's like a very touristy spot in my state. It's got amazing beaches, things like that. Yeah, it got hit bad. Like everyone lost all their power, beaches are destroyed. I guess the only saving grace of them is that it happened at the end of summer after the tourism season. So at least everything can be kind of repaired before summer starts again. But yeah.
Well, you're alive.
Oh yeah, let's go. It's just weird for a cyclone to kind of hit this far south because we're kind of like not even subtropical where we are. So yeah, it's weird, but I don't know, something fun. Just going about your week and then you're like, oh yeah, cyclone's coming. Cool.
All my meetings are canceled.
Yeah.
Word. So the documentation update it's coming along. I think I'd mentioned that I would like to have something up today before the stream, but I haven't had a chance to sync with Nikita yet. I really, with all the sort of issues that, looking at the different types of issues that people have, I'm finding that more and more people are writing Nativewind using like LLM stuff, which I think makes sense. And I want to lean more into empowering people to do so. Like I want to make sure that what they're getting is, the proper thing to their version or whatever, like especially with like incoming changes for things like version 5. So in addition to just the work that Nikita is doing visually for the update, right? I am going through learning, frankly, a lot about just how to best like index this stuff for LLMs to be able to consume it meaningfully. And I think that'll actually, I don't even know how you quantify it because it feels like SEO work a little bit, but I'm hoping that we sort of see it over time. Sort of like vibe wise, people really start to enjoy using it. Yeah, and it's just this unique thing that I think we have that other styling libraries, just due to volume alone, that other styling
Yeah.
libraries just don't have. So why not play to it? Um, yeah. Um, I was curious how version 5 was coming along. Um, how you're like
Yes.
internally like quantifying the progress on that.
Well, I was hoping to try and get some stuff out before the cyclone, but that got put on hold when we started to need to do cleanup and stuff.
Mm.
Uh, so it's good, but I've just realized the problem with it. But I'm still hoping to get it out sooner rather than later. It definitely, like, the aim is this month to get this out. Um, what we're doing is, because the config's been moved into CSS, we're going to make the CSS a little bit easier to write the custom things for as well, which kind of
Hmm.
has like some big fallback changes. And so this is going to be like kind of the last of the big breaking changes that we're going to do. So before, a lot of the config, so this more applies if you're going to do like in your theme, you want to have like device colors, like certain colors on iOS, certain colors on Android, or certain widths, some certain values. You can still do it in the JavaScript, but we now need a CSS version of that because in V5 all the configs moved to CSS, and so we have to come up with a new like superset of CSS that we can parse to kind of like parse out these options. And the way that's going to happen now is via basically media queries. So, for example, in a media query, you can say like a query type if it's going to be like for print or for display on a screen. Um, so we're kind of like hijacking stuff like that and providing like a superset to also be like, okay, cool. You can say that this is a media query for iOS or media query for Android or media query for web, and then actually like write the CSS variables that you need to apply those theming values inside these like media queries. And this kind of has like knock-on effects because it's kind of cool because you can nest queries and you can kind of compose them together. So you could actually say now like on iOS with these screen dimensions have like these CSS variables. And then on these screen dimensions, you use these CSS variables. So you can actually like change the spacing of your app on iOS depending on the screen size and type just via your theme config.
We
Which is something that's, yeah, it's pretty cool. People have kind of asked for, especially going between like portrait and landscape mode is the common one here, where you want to like change how the vertical flow of stuff works and things like that. That's going to be, it wasn't really possible via the JS config before to do that. You would have to implement yourself via CSS variables and kind of like deal with it from there. Now that just gets handled as part of the CSS config because you're just writing normal CSS.
mm,
So that's cool. It's a big change. It's the last thing I kind of want to get in because it is a very big change how you handle things internally. Um, the reason is because before your CSS variables were kind of at the root level, like the global one and the universal variables, they were kind of static. They didn't really change much. But now these variables can actually react to media queries and the conditions that they're in. So they'll change around a little bit, which is pretty cool.
I was gonna say, so we
Yeah.
do that for like Nativewind UI. Some of those like differences between the platforms and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, we wouldn't use a system like that because it just doesn't exist yet. The place where we noticed and what drove us to end up still having separate files, right, for iOS, Android type stuff, is that visually you can have those differences for the most part, but particularly like behavior when you have sort of certain components versus other ones and how they sort of begin to
Mm.
interact with each other depending on how the positioning changes. That's where that really starts to fall apart a little bit. But I think, I think it really just depends on your implementation, um, like your use case. So, um, yeah, I'm interested to play around with that. I want to see, um, how Nativewind UI alone would like change based off of the availability of things like that.
Yeah, well, normally these variables aren't used individually within components. They're more used to how components are composed together. So
Mm-hmm.
like you've got the vertical flow of a website, like how like the spacing between things. It's kind of like the layouts and the paddings and the margins between stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They're the kind of things that people want to change based upon like portrait landscape. You want to make things a little bit squishier, pushed apart, or on a smaller screen size. Maybe you want to change things as well. The other last thing that I'm kind of playing with here is if we have the ability to make these changes, this probably won't come in the beta. This is probably going to be delayed a little bit. But I want to also experiment with setting some known global values. So probably the most requested feature that we have from people, not the 5 requested features, is to be able to set like a universal font family or a universal font size on all text components or
Mm-hmm.
all view components. Um, so we're going to kind of leverage this new tech to also maybe allow certain ones of these values. So we already have special CSS rules to set global variables. So this is if you use like the root pseudo selector or the wildcard pseudo selector. On native, we interpret that as you are setting global variables. We will probably also look at allowing like text in view as an element selector to also allow you to set these values by default for text in view. We're kind of playing around with it. We'll see how it goes. But these would just allow you to apply some default styles to all those components in your app.
Okay.
The reason I'm
That's
kind of playing
cool.
around with it, not too sure what the knock-on effect would be. Like, does this work well inside your application? Cool. What happens when you bring in third-party components? Does this break them,
Mm-hmm.
essentially? So that's what I mean by knock-on effect. It's probably going to take a little bit of testing and getting used to. Not too sure if we'll keep with it. But it's never a good experience when someone is like, hey, let's bring in a styling library. How do I set default styles? You create a new component. It goes a little bit against the philosophy of the library, which is kind of like you should just import things and things should just work. Like that's what we want Nativewind to be. So yeah, this was always a bit of a sore point, and maybe this will help fix it. But yeah, we kind of needed this extra tech in the library to be able to dynamically change these global variables for this to work, both for dynamic allowing media queries for the root values and
Mm-hmm.
on these text elements as well. So
I
that's
was
why
gonna
it's
say,
been a little bit delayed, just because I'm trying to see if I can get stuff in as well. Bit of feature creep
yeah.
is fun.
Yeah, I was wondering like so really quick to answer Simsar's whole thing about like when Tailwind V4 basically hopefully by end of the month we'll see like a beta and that's not beta in terms of who will have access. That's more to like
Yeah, just be a published
just
preview on
yeah,
npm for
just
people
like
to
this is
use.
not ready uh necessarily to be used or like use at your own discretion type of thing. Um yeah, and then sort of progressive iterative changes then after that as we move towards a more like stable implementation, which will also include, like we said previously, like migration guides and highlighted breaking changes and things like this. um, yeah so hopefully that answers that question. The CSS transpiler, I'm like when you say more effectively, I don't know, he's asking about like more effectively implemented. That you talking about like in performance wise, you mean?
Yeah, so the transpile is not changing. So we don't actually we use someone else's transpiler. So Tailwind reads your files and writes out a CSS file. We use a library called Lightning CSS, which is made by the Parcel team, the Parcel bundler. They have their own version of a CSS parser that's built on top of, I believe, Firefox's CSS parser. They've just kind of ported it. And we tap into that to read the CSS file and pull out the JavaScript files from there. To my knowledge, that's the most efficient CSS parser in JavaScript at this stage. I don't think there's any faster one. It kind of blows everything out of the water, and is built upon Firefox's implementation. So it's got that whole open source community kind of behind it as well. So I don't think we can make that more efficient. What we are making more efficient is the runtime. So when we pull out these styles, we basically just have like a style sheet object, like name, here are these styles. And then the other thing we pull out is like metadata of when those styles should be applied. So this is like, for example, these styles have a pseudo class. They should only be applied on hover. Or these styles are, in a media query or a container query. That part is becoming a little bit more efficient, but is going to require some breaking changes. So we're moving that into React 19 and using the new hook available there, the use hook. And we're just making that whole process a little bit more efficient in how we load things. But really that efficiency is coming through a lot of performance efficiency. So one of the changes that we're doing now is where before each component used to be isolated, it used to basically parse its own styles and work out the conditions that it should be. We now have a really efficient hashing mechanism. So based upon the incoming props, we can now generate a hash to say, okay, these styles should be this, and we can reuse that style object across multiple different components. The good thing about this is it makes you like your fast refreshes a little bit quicker, because now we're not refreshing like a million styles and doing a whole bunch of different calculations. We're basically just recalculating this one object and then pushing that out to multiple different components. And this kind of like shared system that we're using, it looks like it's going to be not like super faster, but it's going to make those edge cases where things were a little bit slower faster. But the normal greenfield path is about the same. It's just these edge cases that people are running to and hitting the slow performance, those will be dramatically improved. And so because they're kind of like improved, we're also going to see like maybe a difference in how people use styles. So those edge cases were kind of like, if you hit like CSS variables, if you use like a million of them, or you're doing deeply complicated styles using like style functions and things like that, they will become a lot easier to use now because you won't get those performance hits.
Is this asking Nativewind planning to release component wrapper like Radix? So that is Expo UI plans to be a set of primitives. I don't know if they're Radix based, but as far as Radix based, like Ronan, the same, like the organization, my organization behind Nativewind UI has made RN primitives, which is a Radix UI, Radix primitives based set of components, like just that behavioral headless layer. And we'll be releasing a version 2 of that, which better supports like cross-platform and web. When we started it, we really didn't think much about web in terms of the implementation. So that'll be version 2, and that'll also be in the next like month or two. But I don't know if Expo UI is going to be or is based off of Radix in terms of
it's kind of its own with its own design philosophy. I'm not part of that team, so I'm not 100% sure behind it, but I don't think it's completely based on Radix. I guess like this question kind of goes into like the philosophy of Nativewind and like what we're planning on doing. So our philosophy hasn't changed. We're still, the core Nativewind library isn't going to offer a component system like UI components. This kind of matches with what Tailwind does on the web, where you have Tailwind and then you have a completely separate product for Tailwind UI, which offers these components. They also have another thing called Headless UI, which is kind of like the helper functions, like the primitives to write these components. But they're all separate libraries that are kept separately. And that's why there's Nativewind and then a completely separate project of Nativewind UI, where we kind of like keep those two separate so you can choose if one or the other.
Yeah, and that way, like if you're trying to do one kind of vibe, you do Native Wind UI. If you're trying to do like more of
Yeah.
the shad CN thing, you're using React Native reusables. Both of those are actually both powered by RN primitives. So different component libraries can use the same base set of primitives. But there are still other component libraries, like I think GlueStack, which does not use them, right? I think they implement their own. So, but it's not within, I think, to your point, Mark, it's not within the scope of Nativewind, the styling library, to set up like components or any touch components in any way, shape, or form.
Yes, but we are changing our philosophy a little bit over some things. So before, I think Nativewind v4 was a little bit unfriendly to component libraries who wanted a component. We kind of forced them into a certain way of having to deploy their apps. We're looking at making a change to that in the future, so that you can actually it'd be easier to integrate Nativewind, or at least the styling part of Nativewind, into your actual component library. So there will be some kind of changes there for library authors, but this will mostly affect like GlueStack UI, Nativewind UI, these sort of libraries, and not your application code. You won't see kind of any difference there.
Something that's also on my docket as far as like the community oriented and doc side of things is that there's been a decent amount of trouble that folks have been facing in terms of using Nativewind with things like building libraries like via BuilderBob. And so
Yep.
I want to make that a little bit easier and ideally create some sort of like straightforward way for people to become part of the not quite registry, but like like the family of Nativewind based component libraries or tools, and that'll be available in the new documentation that should go live by the end of this month. That'll be sort of this section of the documentation where you can find all of those resources.
Yeah, so we might actually push out a minor version to deal with the builder Bob issue. I think now is like we can kind of talk about what's happened there. Essentially, Meta and Metro have a way to say that you should build and deploy your React Native apps. They believe that React Native should not be transpiled, that you should just be kind of pushing out the source code, and during application build time is when the transpilation should happen. So that's when the JSX gets turned into a function. They believe that that should happen on your machine when you're building and compiling the code, because that's kind of how the native or the mobile ecosystem works. If you're using Swift or Kotlin, you would bring in these libraries and then compile everything inside Xcode and then push that up. That's kind of against how the web ecosystem works, which believes that transpilation should happen on the library author's machine, and then they should publish the transpiled code. So the code that's already been through the transformation gets published to NPM. It's the opposite. And inside the React Native community, there's been a lot of discussion over which is the correct approach. Do we keep with what Meta is saying, or do we adopt what the web is doing? Because there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to either approach. And up until all the library authors have kind of said, look, Meta controls React Native. We will follow what they do. They build Metro. They say this is the best way to do it. We'll keep doing it like this way. React Native Builder Bob, in their latest major version, decided to adopt the web's approach. And they're the first kind of build tool or library that has made this switch. And because of that, it was kind of unannounced as well that they were going to make this switch. And we flagged it to them that it's going to be a break and change, break things like Nativewind and Emotion and other styling libraries that relied on the traditional way of doing things. But they've gone ahead and done it anyway. So now we're kind of waiting to see what would happen if the ecosystem would update to this latest version, or if people would, stay on the old things. And what we're seeing is that a very small group of people are actually moving over. And I guess we just have to accommodate these people. So we're going to have to change how we work The way this works is we used to do a JSX transform, and the JSX transform relies on this transpilation. So when you do it on your local machine, when you do the build, that's when we can inject our code and hook into things. But if you download code off npm that's already compiled and already transformed, well, then we can't inject our code because it's already transformed. So that's the core of the problem there. What we're going to have
On
to
the
do
other,
is,
I was going to say,
so
on
we
the
can't,
other hand, is you benefit from the performance of having
yeah.
done that transpilation beforehand.
Yes, so I guess I'll touch on that briefly. Like the reason why the web's version people like it is because it has it increases your or decreases your build times, makes your builds faster, because you don't have to do the work because it's already done on someone else's computer. It's like you've downloaded the final version. The reason why that's not as much of an issue inside React Native is because you only need to do that once and then it gets cached, and then it just uses the final version on your local machine as well. The annoying part is whenever the cache gets busted or you push to like EAS or you run things inside your CI, you don't necessarily have that cache there. And that's why React Native can be sometimes really slow to build apps. Like if you use EAS to build a dev client for you, sometimes it can take a couple of minutes, while on your machine it takes pretty quick. It's just because it doesn't have that cached version because it has to do all this work. So yeah, like that's where the argument is that the web's better because it's a little bit faster, but the native people say, well, maybe you should just have a better caching system. But anyway, so the point is that we need to change how we hook into people's code to accommodate for this web way of doing things, and that we will have to do some things a little bit dirty, because essentially Meta built this way in React for us to hook into. Like the JSX transform was this is the proper way of doing things. If you want to change this, hook into this and you can do it here. Now, when we don't have that option, we kind of have to do the nice and dirty way of using a Babel code transform to go and parse your source code to actually work out where we think we should hook into and kind of inject it there. It's not impossible. It's just not as clean. It doesn't have like this perfect API for us to use anymore. We have to kind of build something ourselves.
I was going to say, ideally, we could set it because there's a lot of desire for it. At least the people who are doing it are a certain archetype of person, I think, right? There's different archetypes of developers, all with different motivations and levels of when they're going to quit, and I think the specific group of people that we're talking about here with the Builder Bob folks have a little bit of a higher tolerance of the work they're willing to put in. And so I would hope that we'd be able to shift a little bit of that ownership, that agency to their end, so long as we are able to point to the places where that work would need to be done. I'm not entirely sure. It'd be interesting to have like sort of set of the community that's oriented towards that stuff, the same way we have like the Vite folks and the Repec, right, folks. Like you'd have just like a separate group of people who are like, we want to build stuff that is tooling on top of native, that factors in for Nativewind. So I'd be interested to see how much they're willing to take on, because realistically, it's hard to imagine how we would be able to do that on top of the other stuff. But
yeah, well, the good news is we've already got a lot of the work kind of there as well. So this is done inside the Babel plugin, where the Babel plugin only exists kind of for this use case, where we try and hook into code that was already compiled before. It's just that this is like a different type of code, so we just got to have different rules to change it. So kind of a work is someone just needs to go into that Babel plugin and kind of look at the conditions that we have there and kind of update things from there. Okay. The other way we're kind of thinking about tackling this in V5 is giving options for people to opt out of the JSX transform. So if they don't want to use the JSX transform anymore, that's cool. They can go through a different way of doing things. And we're going to simplify this by combining CSS interrupt function and the remap prop functions into just one function that we're going to bring back called styled that kind of just handles this. And we're going to publish like better docs on how to just use the styled function and opt out of using the JSX transform altogether.
Speaking
Just
of
because,
publishing, I was going to say,
right?
speaking of the docs, is like the next stuff that's going to get a big revisit in order is the dark mode stuff. People ask about being able to do the dark to light mode switch, but not with the sort of like immediate kind of flick of the switch. More of a transition. Right after that is going to be the font stuff that we were talking about earlier. But not quite. Is like just what the font, what working with custom fonts looks like. And yeah, those are the two big ones at the moment. Style would come after that, but I think it's just going to be the relevant once version 5 drops. So
cool.
If I'm not
I think
mistaken.
I saw something. Maybe I think Expo Google Fonts is getting some love soon as well, and might see an update, which will bring it. I think that package has had a bit of trouble for a while. So once that's fixed up, that'll allow people to easily use the Google Fonts again as well.
To answer Simsar's question regarding the Expo Nativewind thing, Mark is the only one that actually works on Expo and Nativewind simultaneously. I do Nativewind and like a bunch of other stuff. There is no efficiency in time management, is my answer. It's just you kind of do what you can, and we have separate responsibilities, and I think we're doing an okay job of it.
We've both got full-time jobs. My full-time job is to work for Expo, and then Nativewind is just a personal project that we both have on the side. So this isn't our full-time job. This is just something that we like doing, something that we thought the community needed. And so that's kind of what this is. And these office hours are just kind of filling people on how we're going on the project process there.
Yeah. I'm sorry if I cut you off before. I don't know if you were like continuing a thought beyond the what we were talking about.
What was I talking about?
Well, going into version 5, like I was wondering if the styled function coming back is going to be something we'll include in the version 5 docs only, or if that's going to be something that's going to bridge to like sort of backport to version 4 and stuff.
I think we'll just push forward with it being in the version 5 docs only. I don't want to like change things up for the people who already use it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be like hey, moving forward, because you could already use the CSS interrupt function kind of like a that's maybe we can update the docs on that. There are some docs for it, but they don't go into detail.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we just could kind of push forward in V5 of being like, hey, this is kind of how it works a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. Yeah, there will already be structural differences to each variant of the docs, which will continue to be a thing. You'll still be able to access the version 2, version 4, and version 5, and we don't talk about version 3. Like Valve, we don't do version 3 of things.
No, you just skip over it.
We skip over 3. It's unlucky.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's all the updates, right? Is there anything to be aware of with respect to Expo? I mean, someone was asking about we still support Expo Router. The instructions are still there. There's the default for Expo setup. But I just kind of figured while reworking that documentation that doing Expo Router and Nativewind should be less a guide and more just like a preset configuration, which you can do via either Create Expo app, which has a template for it, or via rn-new.
We're going to kind of mirror how React Native does its documentation, where obviously Meta has now said that the best way to do, or the only way to do React Native now is with a framework. And that if you're starting a new project, you should be starting a new project with Expo. So our docs will match the React Native docs. We'll lead with that. But and just like in the same way that the React Native docs say like, hey, here's like a new project command that you can run of like create Expo app, we're going to offer, the create commands up front. So you can kind of pick which kind of styling library you want. There will be like an Expo template, but we're going to offer ones for the other products as well. Like, use this if you want to use like Nativewind UI with your project as well, things like that. So we're going to try and like make this setup quite similar, I think, to the React Native setup. So if you look at the React Native docs, how they kind of have things there, I think is how we will probably be moving forward, just to kind of make things familiar. At the moment, I think the docs are a little bit like too freeform with like choose your own adventure, which is
I've tried to make sense of it with respect
yeah,
to. I'm looking forward to removing the 49 section,
yeah.
which I think will go away with the next SDK release. Just given how like Expo supports or does not, sort of like lifetime or whatever, like it just falls out of favor. And
But
so
also,
yeah.
we should say here about our community initiative as well. That we're gonna before in our docs, we didn't really talk about like how to use other bundlers or even like framework lists or Next.js. It didn't really get much love, simply because these were like
Just
unofficial
bandwidth. It's like you just,
platforms that people still kind of use. So we've actually connected with community leaders from different bundlers, different things, and we're looking at helping them have a page in the docs that they can maintain and a channel inside our Discord where they can answer these sort of questions. So we're kind of like delegating a lot of the setup to these actual community leaders who can provide this sort of like best instructions there, because there are alternative frameworks that are kind of upcoming, so like one.js or the repack bundler, things like that. And so we want to have them in the docs because we want people to use them and to try things out, and hopefully with this new community initiative those docs become a little bit better and just less. I think our docs at the moment for framework list is kind of like, yeah, it kind of works if you kind of do this, but you need to know how your framework works internally for it to really work out. Yeah, we should get some better instructions on how that kind of works.
yeah. It's been pretty good. There's been like for monorepo support, right? The NX community kind of threw some together, and I think we'll start to see a little bit more of that stuff. I was going to say an additional thing that I forgot to mention is we moved to, for if you like want to create an issue within Nativewind, right, on GitHub, we have templates from StackBlitz and rn-new, and otherwise known as Create Expo Stack. And I found that there was just like, you can create a project very quickly, but as far as creating a repro, like you actually have to like share it. So I basically like pushed out a feature this weekend that allows you to like one flag publish the project. It should work actually from any Expo project, whether it was generated with like Create Expo Stack or a new or not. So yeah, if you just do like rn-new --publish, it'll just return you a URL, and then you can post that to an issue or whatever. But yeah, very helpful for us to see repros, and that should streamline the process of doing so. Bradley had a question about links. Mark, I think you had mentioned that like the revisit to the way they do CSS is like bringing back a conversation about how what Expo's involvement and Nativewind's involvement is in styling. How much Expo should take an initiative in the way of styling. I haven't had a chance to sit down and look at the technical implementation. So I'm not really like, I don't think I can answer this question.
They've just taken the same approach that we have in terms of like having a CSS file that you can parse and then putting a class name to kind of get it there. From what I've seen, they don't go as in depth as we do. They don't do things like media queries, CSS variables, things like that, which is kind of like the magic that we do internally. I think it's pretty easy to do what they did. And they're already, like before Nativewind, lots of other CSS to React Native libraries that existed. I'm going to be interested to see where they go from here, because obviously this is just their V1. I'm interested to see what sort of like functionality that they implement, but at the moment they don't match the feature set. But we'll see. We also have another project on the side where I'm kind of looking at uni styles as a separate runtime. We've kind of talked about this in previous office hours, which is providing like a subset of CSS for a different sort of runtime. So kind of interested to see how that kind of takes off. Do people are people happy to like get better performance if we drop some of the more advanced features? So we'll see. I'm kind of keeping my eye on it, but it's very basic. And let's kind of see where they kind of go from there. I'm interested to see if they got to take like add anything more to CSS, right? Because CSS was built for the web. There's a lot of things in mobile that don't quite translate into CSS that we've had to like think about and deal with. I'm wondering where they're going to go from here, or if they just kind of keep it super simple. But really, like at the moment, their implementation, it's not much different from having a file called like index.css.js that just has objects in it and just importing those objects onto your components as inline styles. At the moment, it's just kind of like a nicer way of doing that. But we'll see. Okay, I'm going to keep my eye on it.
Mm-hmm. It just also reminded me that I'm going to try to have, especially with things like, what is it, bolt.new and stuff. We talked about having like an actual link to a project for each like little chunk of the docs where folks can see like an implementation of whichever page of the docs they're looking at. Say if that's like the dark mode stuff, you'll be able to actually click through and ideally like run that, actually see what it feels like. Yeah, so that'll be another like new addition, probably not this month but next month.
Yeah, well, we used to have that, but then things became too complicated with Snack and getting it working in our docs. As they do.
As old as time, yeah.
But luckily, this new Bolt stuff makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, it's still using Expo Go though, right? Like, it's not. Yeah. I really want to figure out a way to do like your own version, to be able to publish your own version of an Expo Go.
You just download the Bolt onto your local machine.
Oh yeah,
and build your own dev client and run from there, because it's using Expo Go on your phone. It doesn't have Appetizer, like the web view for Expo Go built into it. You still run it on your own device. So yeah, if you build a dev client on your own phone, it'll work.
Okay. Yeah, okay. All right, a lot of stuff to look into. Is there anything else we wanted to cover, or are we all good there?
I think it's all good.
Awesome. All right, well, everybody, thank you for joining. We'll catch you same time 2 weeks from now, or next week.
All right, next week.
Yeah. All right, see ya.